Thanks everyone, good afternoon. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the land that I live and work on is the traditional land of the Kaurna people, and I respect their culture and their ownership for past, present and future. So my name is Phill Cassey. I'm a conservation biologist in the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Adelaide, and our research group looks at all things invasive species through the interface with wildlife conservation, biosecurity, risk management, and applied ecology. And like everyone else around the country, we have done our fair share of lab interactions over Zoom, and we're getting more and more familiar with this interface, but we much prefer to be outside whenever we can. And we're very lucky in South Australia that we are allowed now to regroup. So we're very pleased for that. So invasive species are a ubiquitous and pervasive component of human-induced global change. So wherever humans have gone, we've taken with us either companion species, hitchhiking species, intentionally or accidentally. And pre-COVID, our world was becoming increasingly connected by the airline and the shipping transport routes. And there really was nowhere that was occupied by humans which was not connected by one of these routes. So you can see the differences on the left-hand side between the global aviation network, and below it, the global shipping network, the frequency in a year, and how highly interconnected all of the continents have become through human occupation. And what this has done is it's led to an extremely rapid accumulation of alien invasive species. So a couple of years ago, Hanno Siebens and colleagues put together this rapidly becoming fundamental paper describing the accumulation of invasive species by their first record rates through time. And so this was a data set of over 45,000 records, around 17,000 individual introduced species. And for many of those, there's no sign of accumulation. So in my short lifetime, we've seen around a third of those first records appearing. And particularly for species of high biosecurity concern, insects, invertebrates, these are terrestrial groups, you can see that there's this strong increase during time. Even for some large-bodied vertebrate species like birds, you can still see that the first record rates are increasing. So we're still introducing species. Probably the one group for which there is a noticeable peak and decline is for chordate mammals, and this is because they were mostly introduced through the acclimatization period, and so we're not introducing red deer and other vertebrate species as much, although we are still moving species around for conservation. And even in Australia, with a very well-known and globally reputed biosecurity system, we have a border which is renowned for being girt by sea, and yet we're still seeing increases of new vertebrate species appearing in our environment at large. And so these are coming in, some of them unintentionally, accidentally, through stowaway pathways, but they're also being introduced intentionally as smuggled species. And what we're seeing is over the last 20 years, we've seen around 200 new alien vertebrate species appearing at our borders and beyond our borders, and the records of new at-large species continuing to increase through time. So the risk from transport to appearance and potentially establishment and impact is continuing, even for large-bodied groups like vertebrates in Australia. And what we really want is to understand how to prevent these introductions and establishment, but push the prevention curve as early as we possibly can to the far side. So just as in medicine, prevention is better than the cure. Also in biosecurity, what we're trying to do is ensure that we reduce the risk of the cost of environmental and economic and social impacts from invasive alien species. And we have an increasingly improved understanding of the pathways that alien species are transported through. So at all stages of these pathways, there's an entrainment. So the original pool of species is large. It's all native and residential species from a donor region, but only some of those obviously will be entrained in the transport pathway. Some of those will survive to be introduced into a foreign environment, and some of those will go on to establish as what we call pest species. So species that are causing a known risk or cost or impact to our environment or economy. And there's certain characteristics of species and the environments which are more likely to facilitate each of these stages. And there's also behaviors, both human behaviors and species-related behaviors, which are more likely to allow species to be entrained. And of course, there's the different pathways themselves and the scale at which those pathways operate across. So we're more likely to see local introductions of propagules of species from human foot or transported pathways, for instance, very local introductions. As the distance traveled becomes greater, we might even start to see stepwise occupation. So planes can get from any region to any other very, very quickly and allow that very quick establishment of a species. One of the areas which we work in is understanding of the illegal wildlife trade. This is a huge and pervasive risk to biodiversity conservation, as well as to the introduction of diseases and invasive species. It's been implicated, obviously, in the origin of COVID-19 and the pandemic that we're currently going through. It's a key driver of biodiversity loss, and it's also one of the most lucrative of organised transnational crimes, alongside smuggling of drugs, arms and people. And one of the things we've learnt from the wildlife trade is that the more that a species is purchased, demanded, transported, the more likely it is to become established. And this is a common theme across a lot of invasive species studies. So here we have, over on the left-hand side, the graphs showing the cumulative number of imports for 4 vertebrate groups within the US. So these are live traded species, and the number that they're imported in millions. And we see how likely they are in those cumulative ranks to become introduced initially and then also established. So the ones that are cumulatively imported more are both more likely to be introduced and also more likely, in red, to be established and to become the risk. And this is termed the risk of propagule pressure. So the pressure on environments of species being introduced in larger numbers. And it's a common relationship across all components of invasive species research, and an essential part of understanding biosecurity risk management. So the relationship for propagule pressure and successful establishment seems to be common across a wide variety of environments, species and studies. So this is data from a range of tightly conducted empirical studies across a variety of scales and taxa, and there's a common slope to all these relationships with individual intercepts. So as the number of individuals of a species are introduced to an environment, the risk of successful establishment increases. And whether you're thinking of the unintentional risk from the shipping industry, or perhaps the sale of songbirds for singing competitions, this risk is similar. The more we transport, the more we sell, the more likely we are to see those accidental or intentional establishments succeeding and therefore going on to become environmental or economic risks. One of the interesting studies we conducted a few years ago was on predicting the risk from ballast water discharges in Australian waters. And this was from the Department of Agriculture's data set on surveys on ballast water discharge from the late 1990s the early 2000s. And so what we've seen in Australia is an almost doubling in the amount of ballast water which is being discharged to Australian waters in that time, largely through the increase in the number of bulkers coming to Australia. So bulkers are the largest of the transport vessels coming to Australia. This is linked to the increase in mining, but also large increases to timber and grain industries. And you can see that most of this discharge is accumulating in two areas. So the Broome, the Western Australian Broome region, ecoregion, and also the Southern Great Barrier Reef region. So this is where the greatest pressure of discharge is from, and and it's largely coming through an increased number of ships from the Yellow Sea and the East and Southern China Seas, as well as the Malacca Straits. So these are the regions which are connecting the most with Australian waters. And so what we really want to do is understand what that risk is. What is the risk from those ships to transporting and releasing that ballast water in our Australian ecoregions? And so there's a couple of different factors there. On the left, we might just look at the numbers of ships between different ports. Obviously, we haven't drawn a great circle distance here. The ships don't go through land. This is just for convenience. But connecting ports between local regions in Australia, we might look at the greatest number of ships. We might look subsequently in the middle at the amount of ballast water discharged between those ports from the survey, or we might actually look at the survival of the propagule. So there's good empirical data from other studies that look at how different propagules in ballast water survive or decay through time. And so the ports that are most highly connected with the greatest transport risk have a decay function that links the donor and the recipient ports by greatest risk. And in fact, what we see is that the greatest risk through propagule survival by the volume of discharged water can then be linked to a small number of consistent routes. And just out of interest, the route that has the greatest number of ships in that period was between Singapore and Fremantle. It is a route that is highlighted as risky, but it's not the greatest risk for propagule survival. So when we want to predict transport risk, what we want to understand is which pathways, which commodities, which species are going to be at the greatest risk to our economy and environment, and are going to pose potentially the biggest impact on those. And one of the, moving on from ballast water, one of the other interesting groups which we have looked at recently is the interception of ant species at borders in Australia. So ants are interesting because they're a globally distributed group. They're highly invasive. They've had some incredibly severe impacts on environments and economies. I know that Queenslanders will obviously agree, and in Brisbane, I'm sure some of you have encountered the red imported fire ants. These are a pervasive component of our invasive alien species. So we looked at the data set of interceptions for the 1990s from the Department of Agriculture's records. We found around 14,000 ant interceptions through those decades, over which half came from Oceania and Asia. The majority were on 4 particular commodity types, so live trees and plants, wood resources, edible vegetables, and edible fruit and nuts. And those commodities were important in the final models we had. One of the interesting things was that the largest number of single interceptions, around 10%, came from Fiji and were predominantly associated with taro leaves. So this is one commodity in country which was immediately picked out from this data. But we also see that the number of interceptions is linked to the weighted transport to Australia. And in a model which includes the commodity type, the distance to Australia, the volume and value of trade imports into Australia, we were able to provide a good empirical understanding of the number of interceptions of live ants, live adult ants, we would get. And by taking a simulation approach to that, we were able to build a predictive model. But not everything's explained. For example, one of the most curious things for me was this very strong relationship here on the right, where the y-axis here is the number of genera for a country, and the number of native ant genera in a country, which is well predicted by the number of interceptions we have in Australia. So we're picking up a biodiversity signal in this data, and a very strong one. And that's quite I think a remarkable and reasonably unexplained pattern. You can come up with reasons for it, but whether they're genuine or not, I don't know. It's I think one of the more fascinating results from this study. But we were able to well predict the transport risk of ant species and the interception and detection for Australia. What we really want to do, though, is have a model that doesn't just combine interceptions, but predicts the actual risk of establishment. And for this, we looked at the establishment of phytophagous insects, so plant-eating insect pests, globally and in Australia. And so we used 2 time periods that were over a decade apart to predict the establishment of these species based on their climate match and the physical transport record, so the volume of trade between a global country, so around 400 different ecoregions, and a state of Australia. And we were able to look at the sensitivity of this model and show that as well as things like minimum distance and total transport into Australia, we were able to use a climate envelope approach to predict the establishment success of species that established in that 10-year period between the 2 global surveys of phytophagous invasive insects globally. And you can play with this risk model in this fancy little shiny app that the lead author Robert Cope made when he was putting together this this particular study. So I'm pretty excited to move on and have my mind blown with the next talk. So I'm not going to muck around too much more. But I did think that the eagle-eyed amongst you have probably realized that I haven't talked a lot about Antarctic science, and I'm an invasive species biologist and a conservation biologist, and I'm excited about the opportunity, extremely excited about the opportunity to work and collaborate with SAEF. But Antarctica is not my historical region of research, and so it is an area that I'm moving into, although I'm going to be extremely well mentored by all the other Antarctic scientists around me. But I did think it was important to try and anchor this around some of the questions that I believe we'll be addressing over the next 7 years, and that I would like to take on board. So understanding and working with colleagues to have an interpretation, understanding of the current and existing risks from invasive alien species, but looking at predictions of how future infrastructure and transport developments to those future planned pathways into Antarctica will affect the risks from invasive species, how other human-induced environmental change, so obviously climate change and biodiversity loss, will affect and influence risks from invasive species. And also not just putting together an understanding of the risks and the lists of species that we're going to consider, but also thinking more forwards to the horizon of what the biosecurity measures are going to need to be in order to ensure that we protect these unique environments. Hopefully that's not too long or long enough, and I look forward to going on to the next speaker. Thank you very much.